So friends, in this part of the lecture on Joan Scott, we take a step towards the concrete ideas that she has to project in her understanding. And for these concrete ideas, once again, I request Professor Richa Bajaj to please begin. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Viewers, we are discussing Joan Scott, and we are discussing her essay Gender, a useful category of historical analysis. Now, in this essay, just taking you to the key points of the essay, where she talks about in her essay, she talks about gender as a concept, as a category that has been analyzed from various angles in the history of feminism. So, for her, she notes that so far there have been these distinct approaches that have been taken taken by historians of gender, and she finds that as far as the methodology is concerned, she talks about these two approaches that have been taken by them. One for her is the descriptive approach, where the phenomena of feminist movements and the history of gender, where the phenomena as such is described without interpreting the realities. And the other is in her view, is the causal one, where one describes the phenomena but also goes into the whys and the hows of it. So while descriptive approach doesn't represent or interpret the realities and the phenomena, causal tries to go a little beyond it, talking about the how and the hows and the whys of it, which means why did gender as what is gender's relation to right, how gender represents this kind of sexual relations of power. So and how it operates in society. So she goes into these two approaches, and then goes on to also suggest how feminist historians then have analyzed gender, and she finds three theoretical positions of feminists so far. And when she looks at these three theoretical approaches or positions of feminists, the feminist historians, she finds that the first approach is entirely a feminist effort, which is purely based on its discussions on patriarchy, on male-female identities, on masculine, feminine, but doesn't go beyond that. The second, the second kind of analysis that has come about in discussions of feminist historians has been this discussion around where feminism is placed in a Marxian framework, right, where it talks about materiality of life, talks about the economic reality of women, and tries to situate feminism within it. The third category for her is one which is divided between a kind of a French post-structuralist kind of theory and the Anglo-American object relations theorist. Now, the French post-structuralist theorists for her are those who dwell on language, on psychoanalysis, on the symbolic order of things, etc. And the Anglo-Americans deal with the real life situations of women, their real relations, and it's more experience centric. So for her, the object relation theorists actually stressed the actual experiences of the gendered subject, that is the woman, while the post-structuralists focused on language in communicating and interpreting gender as such. So that is the basic kind of a framework that she gives around feminist history and feminist historians, and the methodology that they have been taking, descriptive or causal, or the different approaches that they have been taking, whether it is the Marxian French psychoanalysis, French post-structuralist, or Anglo-American in that sense. So this has been a kind of a history of feminist thought for her. But if you could look at the quote from the text itself, I'd like to point this out. She says, the history of feminist thought is the history of the refusal of the hierarchical construction of the relationship between male and female in its specific context, and an attempt to reverse and displace its operations. So in a way, it's the refusal of the hierarchical construction of relationships between male and female in the specific historical context that they are a part of, and it attempts to reverse or displace this operation, this kind of hierarchical order that exists between the relationship between male and female. So that has been for her the history of feminist thought so far. And gender for her should be an analytical category, according to her. So far there has been a lot of discussion around gender. Gender is seen as a social construct which is imposed on the sexed body, for instance, right? For most feminists so far, it's a kind of it is to be understood separately from sexual identity. So on one hand there is sexual identity with what one is born with, but then there are the social roles that are basically that we associate with gender. So gender is seen as a construct, but she says that we need to move beyond it and look at it as a kind of an analytical category in itself. And look at the screen again, you'd be able to see this quote that I wanted you to look at. It says, "I do not think we should quit the archives or abandon the study of the past, but we do have to change some of the ways we have gone about working. We need to scrutinize our methods." So, her method is one of scrutinizing one's own methods. And then she focuses on the very idea of processes. She said, instead of a search of a singular origin, we should conceive of processes so interconnected that they cannot be disentangled. So her approach is to not look at where you actually reach with the analysis of gender, but to look at gender itself as an analytical category and keep analyzing it and keep seeing how it works in different societies, keep seeing how it has worked in different historical periods as well. So in a way, she's trying to bring us back to the category of gender itself and talk about how gender has been a normative, has had a normative definition of femininity, and that gender is a construct, but then gender needs to be analyzed in the different epochs that it has been a part of. So it is therefore she tries to build a whole understanding of gender on her own. So that has been, those are her key sort of areas, and she thinks that it's not about reaching an end or reaching a kind of conclusion or a sort of resolve, but to find the way in, further in our search for answers. So she doesn't give you any kind of a finality, or she doesn't give you answers as to what is required today. Rather, she talks about analyzing the processes that exist today in life, analyzing the practices, the social practices that exist today, in order to be able to find a solution and in order to be able to get somewhere. So her focus is on the path and the process, and not on the final goal. Of course, the final goal is to bring about a kind of change in society in favor of women, but how that goal is to be achieved, she doesn't tell us. She says what we need to do today in order to reach that answer. So for her, the definition of gender, and this is actually the key part, there are two, she goes on to talk about these feminist historians and their approaches and how gender has been perceived so far in the late 20th century. And then she goes about giving her own definition of gender. Look at how she defines gender. According to Scott, then, the definition of gender has two parts and several subsets, and they are interrelated. Again, the emphasis is always on interconnectedness and interrelated. There are different parts, different subsets to gender, and they're all interconnected. Now, she says that gender is a primary way of signifying relationships of power. What she really means by this, that gender is a primary way of signifying relationships of power, is it is a prime signifier through which you can actually see how power operates in the relationship between male and female. It is through gender that you understand the relationships of power. It is not, she doesn't mention sex here. So she's left behind the idea of sex, assuming that there is a sexed body that is, so to speak, within quotes, neutral, but then there is a gender which is a social role or a construct which is attached to it, and this gender becomes the primary signifier of the relationships of power that exist in society between males and females. So for her, that is what gender is. It is the primary signifier or a primary way of signifying the relationships of power where masculinity and femininity are represented in a particular way. Now,
in her understanding, there seems to be no very specific mention of the idea of identity, women's identity, a woman as a woman. So what explains that? Because she is going into social processes and the political processes. But isn't there something in the gender what can be called closer to identity?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is, and she takes that up, although indirectly. When she talks about identity at least at two places in the essay. One where she is talking about the subjective identity, and that is a part of the subset, in fact, which I was going to discuss. So for her, there is one definition of gender. One part is the definition of gender, which is based on this relationship of power. But the second one is the subsets of gender. And when she is talking about the subsets of gender, then she is referring to these identities that you speak of, and these identities again have been taken from society, right? So for her, you should be able to look at it on the screen. Gender involves 4 interrelated elements for her. Now what are those interrelated elements? One, she says, is culturally available symbols. Now, culturally available symbols give an identity to the woman subject, to the gender, and what are those culturally available symbols? For her, they could come from Christian traditions in the Western tradition, from the symbols of Eve or Virgin Mary. Right? In our context, they could come from Sita or Durga, and so certain other Indian symbols. So they could also contribute to the tradition or the culturally available symbols. Along these lines, women are generally identified. Right. So the identity comes from these culturally available symbols. Culturally available symbols give identity to a woman subject. Secondly, for her, gender is also defined by or involves what she calls normative concepts. Now, normative concepts are those that society gives. Now, these are ones that limit and contain the meaning of the symbols. This is what it is, this is what the symbol has, and this is what the symbol doesn't have. Now, these normative concepts could come from education, they could come from law, politics, from the scientific field. Certain things are supposed to have certain attributes. Certain things are feminine, certain things are masculine. Even in law. So all these. So there are what constitutes the normative and what is a kind of a derelict, or what is a kind of a dissenter, and what is abnormal. So the normative and the non-normative in that sense. So these normative concepts get attached and again give identity to that gender and reflect on that gender, actually construct. She says, well, gender is is a signifier of representation of power. But then what constitutes gender? This is what constitutes gender. Gender is constructed by, so gender is a construct is the first idea all feminists have talked about. But then she says this gender is constructed through culturally available symbols. It is constructed through normative concepts. What is a norm in society that education gives us, law gives us, politics gives us, so on and so forth. And then she says gender is also constructed through kinship. Yes, family, relationships, etc. But it is also constructed through economy and polity. She says you cannot limit it. That would be, again, she says that it would be a very limiting idea to keep gender in the sociological domain of just kinship and community, that it is community that give identity to women or construct the category of gender. Economy and polity also give identity and construct what we call gender. Finally, she comes to the fourth category, which she calls subjective identity, the who I am.
This is what I was talking about.
Yeah. So she comes to the subjective identity, and for that she uses the ideas of Lacan and others, talking about who the subject is, and again going into psychoanalysis also of the conscious subject and the unconscious subject, that what I think I am, who I think I am, all that is again a construct. So the idea, the subjective identity is also something that is a construct which is then attached to gender, or in fact it constructs the gender.
This is a new idea because subjective identity is supposed to be inborn, but you say it's a construct.
Yes, subjective identity is a construct because it has gone through again this socialization, and which is why, so there is a subjective identity that one is born with, but then when she talks about gender, she says subjective identity constructs gender, and this subjective identity, which could be what you are born with, is equally something which has the gift of society, which is in all probability a gift of society, which is something which society has given to you, your idea about yourself. And this is the larger point which I would say a lot of feminists, including Judith Butler, and Lacan, they go on to talk about, not Lacan, Lacan is of course talking about psychoanalysis, but for instance when Judith Butler talks about and appropriates Lacan in her work, then she talks about this idea of how the I is also not an I. She goes about talking about again the sexuality. In fact, Judith Butler complicates the very idea of the sexed body. She said, how do you assume that the body is neutral, is a tabula rasa? The body also has imposed on it certain meanings, and those meanings, where are those meanings coming from? They are coming from society. So she says, whatever you think of the body and its processes and its very material processes, how the body functions, whatever meaning is created around the body is also not non-political. So so for instance when Simone de Beauvoir,
does body react back to the pressures?
No, she says that the body is equally inscribed by culture as as gender is for Judith Butler.
The logic of the body should also come up and talk against the social pressures. That's what Lacan would say, perhaps.
So Lacan is totally talking about psychoanalysis. He's not even going into the domain of feminism. Even if he does, then it's to the detriment of women, I would say. But a lot of feminists have found material in Lacan and Freud that they can draw on and build up because it's such a fertile area, the subconscious and the area of psychoanalysis, that they have drawn on their basic concepts in order to talk about their own experiences and to talk about women's experiences and to talk about when, for instance, you see, Simone de Beauvoir came up with the idea of one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. Now, for Judith Butler, she would say the moment one is born and the body, and one is born with the body, and whatever one hears, one is, that body becomes inscribed with that idea, cultural idea, or that is attached to that body. So that body is not a kind of a neutral identity, has a neutral identity. That gender is inscribed culturally, the body is given some meaning. The moment you give meaning to that person, to that body, the ideas that you attach, the definitions that you have of body parts, she says all those definitions are coming from culture.
So in this discussion, she is closer to Judith Butler.
Yes, very close. In fact, Judith Butler and Scott, both of them draw on Foucault a lot. So their approach is Foucauldian in that sense, and they find his discussions on sexuality meaningful in that sense. So I would say that because both of them are post-structuralists, and they belong to the period of the 1980s or so, when the basic job of feminism has been done. For instance, in the 1960s and 70s, the work around understanding gender and the complications around it, or the complexity around it, this work has been done. 80s onwards, I think feminists are also looking at a fresh approach. They're trying to bring in a new perspective around gender that could be useful and would not limit gender, because you see, like Scott mentions in the essay, that gender is not like class. Gender cuts across classes. So there is no class called a gender, right? Or women cut across classes. So therefore she finds that to talk about class discussions on women may not be very useful, because women are from all sort of classes. So again, when they talk about psychoanalysis, they find that psychoanalysis takes you totally away from society. It takes you totally away from economy, and that may not serve our purpose. So they are drawing whatever they find useful, but then going out of it and speaking about a more cohesive policy or a cohesive sort of perspective, which can take certain ideas from all spheres of life and then create something new.
I think that's a good conclusion of the ideas that she represents, and now that you have done so many lectures, etc. So, which feminists, according to you, are more appealing than others? Say a general thing about the feminists that you would agree with, you would support and uphold, and those which show the way in the direction of betterment, in the direction of being more powerful, being more egalitarian. Which are the feminists that appeal to you generally?
So I would say that all these feminists have something to offer. I would not like to negate anyone. In fact, in that sense, what I do feel about the feminists of, say, for instance, in Butler, I would like to offer a critical view of Butler's one thing, which is that perhaps, when she goes too much into, when she says, again, because they use Derridean approach or the approach of decentering, they would, talk about, flourish and play, keep working, keep working and keep playing with these different ideas and concepts, and you will reach somewhere. Now, till you have a kind of a ideological perspective in place, I do feel that there's going to be so much of heterogeneity, and you can say that, when Butler says that, no woman's experience, you cannot speak of women as a category, because there are so many women's experiences. There is black feminism, there is Indian feminism, there is Western feminism, there is of a class variety feminism. So there are so many there are so many kinds of women's experiences, and you cannot speak of one experience.
Say something about Virginia Woolf, a writer, the second wave feminist, one who...
So early feminists, I completely agree with, Virginia Woolf and Simone de Beauvoir. I think because they had the important role also to play in that period, and they were faced with real challenges, and they were faced with real questions that they had to answer. They had to come up with answers, and they did in their own way. For instance, when Virginia Woolf talks about a more androgynous sort of a person, where she says that it is in androgyny that we'll be able to create a more human space.
Orlando.
When we also otherwise, she talks about how women's experience is women, but then there is a masculine side to women and there is a feminine side to it, and so since both of them are there, then one can feel and think differently, and in both spaces you could turn into a man and a woman. Again, something that actually I feel that post-structuralists have taken up, that gender is, so to speak, performative. Gender is a role that you are performing all the time, that it keeps going in different directions.
Your favorite writer, Charlotte Bronte? Say something about her.
But Charlotte Bronte didn't really write, feminism. Emily Bronte did, and
I think you discussed Charlotte Bronte.
George Eliot.
George Eliot, okay.
Yeah. So George Eliot talked about silly lady novelists, and talked about the contribution of women. Again, you see, the point being that women in the 19th century, I would say that women in the 19th century faced this real problem of being accepted in society, and they had to make a choice and they weren't sure whether they could really speak their minds, because if they spoke their minds, then they wouldn't be accepted very well, and if they are not accepted very well, then they'd face criticism and censure, and and they wanted to be accepted. So perhaps in that period they went on in the direction of imitating writing, and they didn't know what women could write, what women's writing was. So they thought what men wrote was what literature was all about, and they wrote like men. So there was a kind of an imitation of sorts, which even 19th century writers, for instance George Eliot's companion partner, wrote about. Lewis talks about how women need to get out of this imitative phase and speak for themselves and write about themselves. And that phase comes in the 20th century with Virginia Woolf, as we see.
Mary Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft, the early feminists.
The early feminists were, I think, more reform oriented, in the sense Mary Wollstonecraft and Margaret Fuller and the early feminists, they wanted to create a space for women where they could get education. At that time, women didn't even get education, and they were seen as inferior to men intellectually, and they were seen as tied to their domestic space. So, they were trying to win as much space and to broaden their scope, their circle as much as possible. The early feminists, I would say. So, they weren't in that sense radicals, the radical feminist phase comes in 20th century. And, that was the radical phase of leaving, that comes with the suffrage movement, but also in the 1960s in some ways. But 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s onwards, women have, established disciplines. There are studies happening, there are dissertations written, there is work being done on a very big field, there are surveys done. So, it's become academic and in one way, theory oriented, because as such theory sees a kind of a boom in this period. But I think the early feminists had this real problem of actual life. In actual life, they had to create space for themselves.
Please take 3 or 4 sentences to sum up the entire feminist series that we have presented.
On feminism. Sorry, what?
Feminist series that we have presented. Can you sum it up in 3-4 sentences?
So, if I had to sum up, I would say that feminism has come a long way with talking about the ideas of gender, body, mind of the woman, etc. Seeing woman as a kind of a human subject and yet a woman subject, and gone into the history of women's mind, wherein one found that it was very difficult to find the woman behind this subject that we have today. And this is something that I found very important in Kristeva, for instance, in Zixu, for instance. She says that, it is so difficult to find that woman that would have a real actual attribute, because so many layers have been put on her by culture. So, I think what I dislike about contemporary academic feminists is their attempt to theorize more and to go into a field and to keep shifting their base from one to the other. And I like this particular feminist approach, wherein you are discovering and uncovering, in that sense, the different layers that make up this woman's subjective or woman's experience, and of course woman's experience that is centered in the social, political, historical age that they are a part of.
So friends, with this summing up by Professor Bajaj of feminist discussion, which is in her opinion open-ended yet, and there is more to come in the decades that are ahead, we close here the discussion so far as this particular thing is concerned. Thanks very much, Professor Bajaj, for saying this and summing up the discussion in this particular very, very apt way. So thank you.